Hello and welcome back to another video. This time we are going to be talking again about character case conceptualization, but this time we're going to take what I talked about last time where I ran out the basics of how these things work. And if that's something that you are missing, you can always go back and watch the last one. You'll be caught up, but I'll also refresh it a little bit here. But today we're going to do our own very specific example and show you how it's done. And the joy of this is the character that we're going to do, you don't have to see the series, you don't have to know who the character is. You'll be able to follow along just by what I tell you, and hopefully we can have a good conversation in comments or wherever else that manifests. So, of course, today we're doing a character case conceptualization, and I figured to get this started, we would go on one of my favorite topics of all time, and I'm sure you would have guessed it by now because this joke doesn't really work on YouTube where you can click and see the title. But we're going to be talking about Shinji Ikari from Evangelion. So we are going to be talking primarily about him since he's the main character, but of course this could be about any character and his relationships to them. But also this is going to be largely containing the content of the original series, the rebooted movies, those kinds of things. There might be some differences here or there, so if something is out of place or anything like that, do forgive. And also, of course, this will cover pretty much the entirety of the series. I won't try to go into the plot points of the show, but if you haven't seen it and you want to not know things about it, this might be the moment to, click back later. So, before we really get into talking about Shinji, because, he was the purpose that this whole concept exists, really, I'm going to remind you of the three things that really we need to do here. Three questions we're asking in a character case conceptualization are, what are we seeing? How do we understand the information? That is, how do we understand what we're seeing? And what can be done? So these three questions are going to guide us through our discussion today and through my thoughts on this character. And the cool part about this is going to be just my thoughts, right? You all could have very different thoughts that I look forward to hearing. But this is going to be especially paying attention to sort of content and then sort of what that would look like. And the third piece, what can be done, we can also in that question think a little bit about like what would you want to see happen? Because those answers might be a little bit different depending on how you're thinking about the series. So with Shinji, what are the things that we see? So this, we see a lot of different things from Shinji. Since he is our main character, we spend a lot of time with him in Evangelion. The big ones that jump out at you, he has a lot of what I would probably identify as a clinical term, depression. He's very sad. He has, loss of joy. He doesn't have a good time. He has a lot of strain in his life. He has a lot of anxiety, especially around performing tasks that he's ordered to do, which is a problem because his whole job is to get in giant robots and save the world. And then he has a lot of fear. So he has a lot of times where he's paralyzed by fear or anxiety or indecision and is unable to perform the task that he's supposed to do. And I would, sort of argue that part of that is because he's like 14 years old and the world's ending all around him. But these are some of the pillars that I think are really big. You could make the argument that he has other sort of more psychological symptoms, but that's maybe outside the realms of this conversation. But I think it's very clear that he's going through a really hard time mental health-wise. He has breakdowns multiple times in the series, and he does a lot of very strange things that you or I would consider to be really problematic when talking about someone of his age and someone that, what we do expect of him. So across those things, I think the biggest one that jumps out to me is there's a lot of times where he just kind of loses control of his emotions or is unable to do anything, is just kind of shut down. I think that speaks to where his mental health is. Another big one that jumps out to me is he has a lot of strain around his social and familial roles. So in the context of Evangelion, his mom is dead, kind of, and his dad is his only parent, except his dad has not parented him and got rid of him before the start of the show. In fact, the first time we meet Shinji in the first episode is he is coming back to spend time with his dad, or at least that's what he thinks. So he has a very strained family life. I don't know if any of y'all remember being that age, or if you are that age, but not having parents and not having supportive people can be a really big deal during that time. Another thing to mention is we don't actually know where he was before the start of the show, or at least I don't. So it's possible that he wasn't even with supportive people there either. That boils into my next point here to say that his social life strain is a big deal as well. So when you're this age, one of the things we know about people is they start to rely on their close friends and their friend groups to do things that maybe their family used to do for them, their parents used to do for them. And Shinji gets uprooted at the beginning of the show, but also gets put in a context where, like, people there don't like him, or he is put into a structure of, like, a paramilitary organization where, maybe not, people aren't really worried about being his friend. The other thing, too, is he's also expected to sort of be a normal high school student, except his friends die, like, often and horribly. And knowing that you or your friends could die at any given moment, and being thrown into these life or death situations obviously puts a lot of strain on those relationships. How do you get close to these people if you can't trust that they're going to be there tomorrow? How do you try to reconnect with your dad when he wants nothing to do with you? Which is the case for most of the show, right? Shinji's dad is a horrible, horrible father who is obsessed with, doing these other weird things that don't actually involve parenting Shinji or treating him well, right? Another piece here is that he's in just severe distress most of the time. So this kind of seems obvious. A lot of people don't like Shinji for this reason, because he's constantly distressed past the point of his tolerance in the show. And that's a problem because, number one, it makes him a less likable character for a lot of people. But number two, if you are a young person and you are constantly past the point of no return on stress, this is where you're going to see these things happen. You're going to develop psychological symptoms. You're going to break down and not be able to continue with life. And that's indeed what we see happen with Shinji. There's multiple times where he refuses orders or doesn't do what he's supposed to in the context of his job or school or things like that. There are a lot of times where he does very objectionable, kind of messed up things because he is so distressed and can't process or handle what's going on. And some of those are not family friendly, so I won't even talk about them. But for those of you who've seen the show, you know. And the last one is he refuses to get in giant robots. So Shinji's whole job is to jump into giant robot, pilot giant robot, save world. And Shinji does a very bad job of this, to the point where this is like a recurring meme. If you see Evangelion, I actually have a shirt that says it, because it's just a thing, right? Shinji's job is supposed to do these things, and he doesn't do them. So that's a big life stressor. In psychology, the benchmark for stress, the benchmark for psychological troubles is often, is it impacting your life? Is it making things harder or more difficult than usual? And I would say in this case, the refusal to get in the robots, the distress, I think that shows us that it is indeed impacting him. So let's move on a little bit to how I understand what's going on for Shinji here. So for me, I don't necessarily operate from this lens all the time, but a big piece for me is attachment. So when we're young, often what happens to us is we become attached to our primary caregivers. Usually that's parents, that can be grandparents, it can be others, but we become attached, and those attachment figures become a really big deal for us. People that we learn are safe, people that teach us about the world, that we trust. And so Shinji has this problem with his attachment figures because his mom's dead, kind of, and his dad isn't around and has proven himself not to be a trustworthy attachment figure, which creates what is called in psychology an attachment wound, which, I don't need to go into the detail of, but suffice to say, Shinji's carrying around this trouble, this lack of ability to be attached to people. And especially that goes into some problem when you start talking about authority figures. So Shinji's dad is his authority figure because he's a parent, which makes sense. But Shinji's dad is also his boss. And Shinji's dad really doesn't care about his well-being all that much, which creates problems, obviously. And Shinji's dad actually puts him in the care of his Shinji's direct superior officer, who is also not a very good authority figure, who constantly drinks to excess and is inappropriate with Shinji in numerous different ways. And this further contributes because one of the ways we learn to get over attachment issues or we repair our attachment wounds is by attaching to other people that are safe, that are good, that show us a different, new, better way. And Shinji gets put in this world where he doesn't have any really good attachment figures. He's got his direct superior officer who is constantly drunk and giving bad advice and being inappropriate. He has other coworkers that give him terrible advice about like women and relationships. And he doesn't really have close friends. Like his friends die or become injured or don't care for him. And that perpetuates those wounds. It doesn't heal them, which is a big problem because you're going through this age. This is the kind of age where this kind of thing can really take off and be problematic. Another thing I would say is I understand Shinji's behavior as a normative response. So I know a lot of people don't like to hear this, but Shinji's like 14 years old and has been messed up. And the situations he's in are messed up. And I know that we watch series and anime and all this, and you're supposed to. The protagonist is always a young teenager. You always deal with it. They save the day. And Shinji is sort of the bizarro version of that, where it's normal for him to freak out, to be told, like, you have to save the world or else we all die. It's normal to crack under that pressure for a 14-year-old kid. It's normal to be whiny and want your dad to love you as a 14-year-old kid. It's normal to have all these weird things going on. So I think on some level, what Shinji's doing makes perfect sense here. That it's just our lens, potentially, makes it more difficult for us to see. And the last big thing is Shinji's just a traumatized kid. And people manifest reactions to trauma in lots of different ways. You can have people that get startled very easily or very scared. You can feel that are angry all the time. You can have people that are sad all the time. But Shinji's responses, as much as they are normal responses to other things, they're also trauma-based responses. Shinji's mom is gone. Shinji doesn't have a dad that cares for him. Shinji is in a really horrible situation. And that's just kind of how it is. That these traumas come out in the symptoms we see. These traumas come out in those breakdowns and the weird behavior and all of that. And so that's kind of how I understand that he has been wounded and traumatized so much that this is explaining what our outcome looks like here. The last piece here is, what do we do with this information? What do we do with Shinji? Yeah. And the first one I would be curious about if Shinji's sitting across me, would be understanding how he sees his life, and how does he change that? Or how could we change that? Because it's possible that my view of his problems would be different from his own. And the thing is, I bet nobody asks him, and nobody does in the series, ask him how he feels about the thing. Nobody asks him what he wants necessarily in that sort of philosophical way. And I think giving him the opportunity to talk about it would be a big deal, because a lot of times people just need to talk about this kind of stuff and they've never had a chance before. But the other one might be that if he is able to articulate how he feels, maybe he can articulate a better way forward for himself, or articulate his needs, which we could work on meeting. So that's the first part. The second part is he really needs to find a healthy attachment to a healthy partner. And no, I don't mean like in a fanfic way where he, ends up with somebody in a, kind of PG-13 kind of a way. I mean, having a friend or a mentor or a partner, romantic or otherwise, that gives him that love, that unconditional love, that care that he desperately needs. Because he needs that. Because he carries this around and wears it. He's desperate for it. And so finding something that heals those wounds would go a long way for Shinji. And at worst, it at least makes him feel better about his situation. But at best, that's the kind of thing that, like, if you realize that you don't need the love of your parent in that way anymore, then you can deal with that. Like, you can deal with your dad being awful because you can get that somewhere else, right? And then the last one, Shinji needs more therapy than you'd think. So This is just really obvious that Shinji really desperately needs to talk to people and have help, but I think that makes sense, and especially makes sense in the context of the show Evangelion, because in Evangelion, they're like, okay, let's get these teenagers together and make them fight giant robots against monsters and save the world. And there's a reason why the military has psychologists, yeah? And my thinking here is, like, if you want Shinji to get in the robot, yelling at him and beating him and, being horrible to him, maybe isn't likely to get your message across. So maybe you'd want to take advantage of, he needs some help. He needs some therapy. And I think that makes sense for the context of the show. But also, it must be said that people with a lot of complex things going on, people with attachment issues, people with breakdowns, often take a long time to work through. It's not like a go in for 3 or 4 weeks and you get fixed up kind of situation. So I think that's an important piece here as well. So, with all this being said, this is my character conceptualization of Shinji. He's a young kid responding in normal ways because he has attachment wounds, because he's been traumatized. But this gives us an opportunity where you can talk back and say, like, I think about him a different way. I think these details lead to a different interpretation. But remember that really the only 3 things that we asked, the 3 questions we asked in this, were what are we seeing, how do we understand the information, and what can be done? And with those 3 questions, we can really do a lot of work going towards learning more about this character, having a deeper conversation that allows us to not just disagree on something, but articulate why, and to get into a really interesting place where we can both talk about things we care about, and also go a little further. So keep that in mind. Again, we can do this multiple times on multiple different characters, but that's my take, and I look forward to hearing more from you all. So thanks for watching, and I hope I'll see you in the next one.